On a freezing winter night in December 1837, flames illuminated the dark waters of the Niagara River. A small American steamboat, engulfed in fire, drifted helplessly toward the thundering Niagara Falls. Her name was the Caroline, and her destruction would bring two nations, the United States and Great Britain, to the very brink of war. This is the story of an international incident that began with rebellion, escalated with bloodshed, and ended by reshaping the very laws that govern warfare between nations to this day. This is the story of the Caroline affair. To understand why the Caroline burned, we must first understand the man whose dreams of revolution set these events in motion. His name was William Lyon Mackenzie, a Scottish immigrant, a fearless journalist, and a radical reformer who would stop at nothing to change the government of Upper Canada. Born in Dundee, Scotland in 1795, Mackenzie arrived in Canada with fire in his belly and revolution in his heart. By the 1820s, he had established himself as one of the most controversial figures in Canadian politics. Through his newspaper, The Colonial Advocate, Mackenzie relentlessly attacked what he called the Family Compact, an entrenched network of wealthy elites who controlled Upper Canada's government, enriching themselves while ordinary citizens struggled. Mackenzie wasn't just a critic, he was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada. But his radical views made him enemies. The Assembly expelled him not once, but repeatedly. Each time, his constituents defiantly re-elected him. The message was clear: the people wanted change, but the establishment refused to listen. By 1837, after a decade of failed attempts at peaceful reform, Mackenzie had reached a breaking point. If the British colonial government wouldn't reform through peaceful means, he would force change through revolution. On December 5, 1837, William Lyon Mackenzie led several hundred armed men down Yonge Street toward Toronto. His plan was audacious: seize control of the government, capture Lieutenant Governor Sir Francis Bond Head, and declare Upper Canada a republic free from British colonial rule. But Mackenzie had badly miscalculated. The spontaneous popular uprising he expected never materialized. Instead, colonial militia forces, led by the loyalist Colonel Allan Napier MacNab, a wealthy Hamilton lawyer and veteran of the War of 1812, arrived first with several hundred well-armed men. The rebels, poorly organized and outnumbered, retreated in disarray. 3 days later, on December 8th, Loyalist troops under Samuel Jarvis marched on Montgomery's Tavern, the rebels' headquarters just north of Toronto. The battle was over almost before it began. Mackenzie's forces scattered into the winter landscape. The Upper Canada Rebellion appeared to be finished. But Mackenzie wasn't done yet. Fleeing the failed rebellion, Mackenzie escaped across the frozen Niagara River into American territory. There, he found exactly what he was looking for: sympathy, support, and armed volunteers ready to fight for his cause. To many Americans along the border, Mackenzie embodied the spirit of 1776, a patriot fighting to throw off the chains of British tyranny and establish a republican government. These weren't just idle sympathizers. They were willing to take up arms. In mid-December 1837, Mackenzie made a bold move. He returned to Canadian territory, but not to the mainland. He occupied Navy Island, a small strategically located piece of land in the Niagara River, technically on the Canadian side, but close enough to the American shore to receive supplies and reinforcements. There, on Navy Island, on December 13, 1837, Mackenzie proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of Canada. He designed the flag, established a provisional government, and began issuing proclamations calling for democratic reform and an end to British colonial rule. But proclamations don't win wars. Mackenzie needed supplies, food, weapons, ammunition. And for that, he needed a ship to enter the Caroline. The Caroline was nothing special, a modest 46-ton sidewheel steamboat owned by William Wells, a businessman from Buffalo, New York, built in 1824 and measuring just 75 feet long. She could carry up to 45 tons of cargo and passengers between American ports on the Niagara River. But in late December 1837, the Caroline took on a new role. Chartered by sympathizers of Mackenzie's rebellion, she became the lifeline connecting Navy Island to the American mainland. Day after day, the Caroline ferried supplies, weapons, and American volunteers across the river to Mackenzie's rebel camp from the Canadian shore. British forces watched helplessly as the Caroline made trip after trip, brazenly supporting an armed insurrection against the Crown. The American steamboat was operating in American waters, protected by international law. Or so everyone thought. On the Canadian side, Colonel Allan McNabb commanded the Loyalist militia forces along the Niagara frontier. A staunch defender of British authority, McNabb had no intention of letting Mackenzie's rebellion continue. But the rebels on Navy Island were well positioned, and as long as the Caroline kept supplying them, they could hold out indefinitely. McNabb needed someone bold enough to solve this problem. He found that man in Captain Andrew Drew of the Royal Navy. Commander Andrew Drew was a veteran Royal Navy officer, experienced, decisive, and willing to take risks. When McNabb ordered him to dispose of the Caroline, Drew understood exactly what that meant. He would have to cross into American territory, board an American vessel, and neutralize her, an act that would violate United States sovereignty. But for Drew, the mission was clear. The Caroline was supplying an armed rebellion, and she had to be stopped. On the evening of December 29, 1837, Drew assembled a hand-picked force of approximately 60 militia volunteers. They boarded 7 longboats and pushed off from the Canadian shore under cover of darkness. Their destination, Navy Island. The night was bitterly cold. Ice floes drifted in the black water as Drew's boats cut silently through the river. But when they reached Navy Island, they discovered the Caroline wasn't there. The steamer had already returned to the American side and was moored at Schlosser's. Landing in New York under the protection of Fort Schlosser's cannons, Drew faced a critical decision. He could turn back, mission incomplete. Or he could cross into American waters, board an American ship on American soil, and seize her by force. Drew didn't hesitate. He ordered his men to row across the river toward American territory. It was approximately 11:30 p.m. when Drew's longboats approached Schlosser's Landing. The Caroline sat moored at the dock, her crew and passengers asleep below deck. Only a handful of watchmen stood guard. Drew divided his force. Some men would board the ship. Others would secure the dock and prevent interference from the nearby inn where more men were sleeping. As the boats touched the dock, Drew's men moved swiftly. A watchman on the Caroline spotted them. "Who goes there?" he challenged. The response came not in words, but in action. Drew's men rushed forward, boarding the Caroline as her crew scrambled to respond. Chaos erupted. Shots rang out in the darkness. Men shouted. Musket balls whistled through the night air. In the brief but violent struggle, an American watchmaker named Amos Durfee, a black American from Buffalo, was shot through the head. He fell dead on the dock, becoming the first casualty of what would soon become an international incident. Drew's men quickly overpowered the Caroline's crew, driving them off the ship. Some Americans jumped into the freezing river to escape. Others fled into the darkness. Within minutes, Drew controlled the vessel. But he wasn't finished. Drew's orders were to dispose of the Caroline. And he intended to do exactly that in the most spectacular way possible. His men worked quickly. They piled combustible materials in the Caroline's cabin and on her decks. Then they cut the mooring lines and set the ship ablaze. As flames erupted from the steamboat, Drew's men towed the burning vessel into the main current of the Niagara River. And then they let her go. The blazing Caroline drifted downstream, a floating inferno lighting up the winter night. Flames climbed her masts and consumed her deck. The heat from the fire could be felt on both shores of the river. Sparks and embers spiraled into the dark sky. For the witnesses on both banks of the Niagara, American and Canadian, it was a sight they would never forget. The burning ship drifted inexorably toward Niagara Falls, her flames reflected in the black water, creating an apocalyptic vision that seemed to symbolize the state of relations between the United States and Great Britain. According to reports, the Caroline capsized and sank before reaching the falls themselves. But the image of that burning ship had already been seared into public consciousness. As the flames on the river began to fade, Drew and his men rowed back to the Canadian shore. Behind them, they left one dead American, a destroyed American vessel, and an international crisis that would bring their two nations to the brink of war. News of the Caroline attack spread rapidly, and with each retelling, the story grew more sensationalized. American newspapers didn't just report one death. Some falsely claimed that 22 of her crew had been killed. Their bodies sent over Niagara Falls in the burning wreck. The truth was bad enough. British forces had invaded American territory, killed an American citizen, and destroyed American property. For many Americans, especially those living along the Canadian border, this was an act of war. Public outrage exploded. Mass meetings were held in cities across New York and other border states. Citizens demanded action. They called on President Martin Van Buren to declare war on Great Britain and Canada. Newspapers published inflammatory editorials, comparing the attack to British aggression before the War of 1812. In Upper Canada, the reaction was exactly the opposite. The burning of the Caroline was celebrated as a bold military action. Colonel Alan McNabb, who had ordered the raid, was hailed as a hero. The British government would later knight him for his service, making him Sir Alan McNabb, the diplomatic. Temperature between Washington and London dropped rapidly toward freezing. Americans didn't wait long to strike back. On May 29, 1838, 5 months after the Caroline's destruction, a group of 13 Americans, led by the legendary border raider known as Pirate Bill Johnston, spotted a British steamship transiting through American waters in the Thousand Islands region of the St. Lawrence River. Her name was the Sir Robert Peel, named after Britain's former Prime Minister. She was a merchant vessel, carrying passengers and cargo, with no military function whatsoever. Johnston and his men didn't care. In the pre-dawn darkness, they boarded the Sir Robert Peel while she was stopped at Wellesley Island to take on cordwood for her steam engine. The raiders forced all passengers and crew off the ship, looted her cargo, set her ablaze, and cast her adrift, A deliberate echo of what had happened to the Caroline. The message was clear. What you did to us, we can do to you. The burning of the Sir Robert Peel only made the crisis worse. British officials were furious at what they called an act of piracy. American officials pointed out the hypocrisy. Hadn't Britain committed the same act first? Both nations began moving troops toward the border. War drums were beating on both sides of the Canada-US frontier. If someone didn't step in to de-escalate, blood would flow in far greater quantities than the single death of Amos Durfee. President Martin Van Buren faced an impossible situation. His own citizens were demanding war with Britain. Yet Van Buren understood that such a war would be catastrophic for the still young United States. The nation was still recovering from the panic of 1837, an economic crisis that had plunged the country into depression. War with the world's most powerful empire would be ruinous. Van Buren needed someone who could calm the border tensions before they exploded into open warfare. He turned to one of the most respected military figures in America, Brigadier General Winfield Scott, who would later become one of America's greatest generals and the Union commander at the start of the Civil War, was dispatched to the Canadian border with clear instructions: prevent American citizens from launching raids into Canada, enforce neutrality laws, and keep the peace. It was an enormous responsibility. Scott traveled along the border, meeting with local officials, speaking to angry crowds, and using his considerable authority and rhetorical skills to convince Americans that vigilante justice and cross-border raids would only lead to disaster. Scott's presence had a calming effect. He didn't stop all cross-border incidents. The so-called Patriot War would continue sporadically for another year, but he prevented the situation from spiraling into full-scale war between the United States and Britain. Meanwhile, in Washington, diplomats began the slow, careful work of negotiating a settlement to the Caroline crisis. Just when it seemed tensions might begin to ease, a new crisis erupted, and this one nearly destroyed everything. Winfield Scott had accomplished. In November 1840, a Canadian deputy sheriff named Alexander McLeod was traveling through New York State when he made a fatal mistake. After having a few drinks in a tavern, McLeod began boasting about his role in the Caroline raid. According to witnesses, he bragged that he had personally killed Amos Durfee. Word reached New York authorities, and McLeod was promptly arrested and charged with murder and arson. The British government was apoplectic. Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, sent a furious dispatch to Washington. McLeod was acting under orders from his government. He could not be tried as a criminal. If he was executed, it would be considered an act of war. Let that sink in for a moment. The execution of one man in an American courtroom could trigger a war between the United States and the British Empire. President Van Buren found himself in a constitutional crisis. Under the American system, the federal government had no authority to interfere with New York State's prosecution of a murder case. The matter was entirely in the hands of New York's courts. Governor William Seward of New York refused to dismiss the charges, insisting that McLeod receive a fair trial under American law. The British government began preparing for war. Troops were mobilized in Canada. The Royal Navy readied its ships for months. As McLeod sat in jail awaiting trial, the United States and Britain stood on the edge of armed conflict. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic published inflammatory articles. Diplomatic relations deteriorated to their worst point since the War of 1812. Finally, in October 1841, McLeod's trial began in Utica, New York. The courtroom was packed. The world watched anxiously. McLeod's lawyers mounted a simple defense. He wasn't even there. They produced witnesses who testified that on the night of December 29, 1837, Alexander McLeod had been in Chippewa, Canada, nowhere near Schlosser's Landing or the Caroline. After deliberating for just 20 minutes, the jury returned a verdict, not guilty. McLeod walked free. The immediate crisis was over. But the fundamental questions raised by the Caroline affair remained unanswered. Under what circumstances could one nation legally violate another's sovereignty? When was preemptive action justified? Those questions would be answered not on a battlefield, but in diplomatic correspondence that would change international law forever. By 1842, cooler heads in both Washington and London recognized that the Caroline crisis and related border disputes needed to be resolved through negotiation, not warfare. The United States Senate's most brilliant legal mind, Daniel Webster, the Secretary of State under President John Tyler, Webster, was one of the great orators and constitutional lawyers of his generation, a man who could argue cases before the Supreme Court in the morning and draft international treaties in the afternoon. Britain sent Alexander Baring, Lord Ashburton then, experienced diplomat with extensive business connections in the United States and a pragmatic approach to problem-solving. The two men met in Washington in the summer of 1842 to negotiate what would become known as the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. The treaty would resolve multiple border disputes between the United States and Canada, including the Maine, New Brunswick, boundary and territorial questions around the Great Lakes. But woven into these negotiations was the Caroline affair and the fundamental question it raised. When could a nation legally use force in another nation's territory in the name of self-defense? In their correspondence during the negotiations, Webster and Ashburton exchanged letters that would become foundational documents in international law. Lord Ashburton, writing on behalf of the British government, defended the attack on the Caroline as a legitimate act of self-defense. The Caroline was actively supplying an armed rebellion against the Crown. British forces faced an immediate threat, and they had a right to defend themselves. Daniel Webster responded with one of the most important letters in the history of international law. Yes, Webster acknowledged, nations do have a right to self-defense. But that right is not unlimited. Webster wrote, "It will be for the government of the United States to show that the local authorities of Canada, even supposing the necessity of the moment authorized them to enter the territories of the United States at all, did nothing unreasonable or excessive, since the act, justified by the necessity of self-defense, must be limited by that necessity and kept clearly within it." Then Webster articulated the test that would bear the Caroline's name. It must be shown that the necessity of self-defense was instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means, and no moment for deliberation. This became known as the Caroline Test or the Caroline Doctrine. It established that anticipatory self-defense, striking first to prevent an imminent attack, could be legal under international law, but only under the most stringent conditions. First, the threat must be imminent, instant, and overwhelming, leaving no time for peaceful alternatives. Second, the defensive action must be proportional to the threat, no more force than necessary to eliminate the danger. Webster essentially said, yes, Britain, You may have had the right to defend yourself. But did you really have no other choice? Was burning the Caroline truly necessary? Was the action proportional to the threat? These questions set the framework for how nations would think about preemptive self-defense for the next 180 years. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty was signed on August 9, 1842. It resolved the border disputes, eased tensions between the United States and Britain, and most importantly, it established the principles of the Caroline Doctrine as part of customary international law. But what happened to the people involved? William Lyon Mackenzie, the Firebrand who started it all, fled to New York. He was convicted of violating American neutrality laws and served a year in prison. He continued to publish his newspaper from exile, never giving up his dream of Canadian reform. In 1849, the British government issued a general pardon, and Mackenzie returned to Canada. He was eventually re-elected to Parliament, where he served until his death in 1861. Remarkably, his grandson William Lyon Mackenzie King would become Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister in the 20th century. Commander Andrew Drew, who led the raid on the Caroline, remained with MacNab's forces until 1839, when he was removed from command for administrative violations. Fearing American retaliation, he returned to England in 1842 and continued his Royal Navy career. Colonel Allan MacNab, knighted for his role in suppressing the rebellion, became one of the most powerful politicians in Canada. He served as Premier of the province of Canada and was instrumental in shaping early Canadian political structures. Amos Durfee, the Black American watchmaker killed during the raid, is often forgotten in the grand sweep of history. But his death crystallized American outrage and nearly sparked a war. He was buried in Buffalo with full honors, and his grave became a rallying point for those demanding justice. The Caroline Doctrine didn't fade into historical obscurity. Instead, it became one of the foundational principles of international law regarding the use of force. When the Nuremberg Tribunal tried Nazi war criminals after World War II, they reaffirmed the Caroline test as the standard for legal anticipatory self-defense. Nazi Germany's claim that it invaded Norway preemptively to prevent a British invasion was rejected because it failed the Caroline test. There was no instant, overwhelming necessity. When the United Nations Charter was written in 1945, Article 51 recognized nations' inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. Legal scholars continue to debate whether this includes anticipatory self-defense, but the Caroline Doctrine remains the framework for that debate. In 1967, Israel invoked anticipatory self-defense when it launched preemptive strikes against Egypt at the start of the Six-Day War. The international community's evaluation of that action and Israel's 1981 bombing of Iraq's Asyric nuclear reactor referenced the Caroline test. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, the Bush administration cited preemption as justification. Critics immediately pointed out that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which were never found, failed the Caroline test's requirement of imminent threat. Even in modern cyber warfare and drone strike debates, the Caroline Doctrine remains relevant. When can a nation strike first? What constitutes an imminent threat in an age of intercontinental missiles, cyber attacks, and terrorism? The questions Daniel Webster grappled with in 1842 remain unresolved in 2024. Today, The Niagara River flows peacefully between the United States and Canada. The two nations enjoy one of the most stable, peaceful borders in the world. It's hard to imagine that once, this border almost erupted in war over a small steamboat. In December 1837. That steamboat, the Caroline, became the spark that nearly ignited a conflict between two powerful nations. Her burning transformed an international incident into a foundational moment in international law. The Caroline Doctrine teaches us that the right of self-defense is not unlimited. It must be balanced against respect for sovereignty, the requirement of imminent necessity, and the principle of proportionality. These aren't just abstract legal concepts. They're the guardrails that help prevent nations from sliding into unnecessary wars. A small steamboat. A cold December night. Flames on the Niagara River, and a diplomatic crisis that almost changed the course of history, but instead changed the laws of war itself. This was the Caroline affair, the ship they burned that almost started a war with Britain.